While chain bookstores are taking over, we are independently moving into our 85th year. And tonight, oh my goodness, I could be like Judy Garland right now. We're thrilled, well, maybe. I'm not going to start singing. We're thrilled to have Patricia Cohen with us, the New York Times journalist, in conversation with Slate's cultural critic, June Thomas. And Cohen, the author of our Prime, The Invention of Middle Age, debunks all our notions of middle age. And in fact, I told her she freed us to be middle age. And for today's format, you guys will talk. And then I think we'll open it up for questions during that discussion. Is that okay with you? And then afterwards, you will sign books, and we will all eat cheese and drink wine. And I'm really thrilled to have you both here, and enjoy.
Thank you. So, Patricia. The subtitle of the book is The Invention of Middle Age, and it was kind of jarring for me to think that middle age isn't something that's just been there since the dinosaurs. Can you tell us about how this thing that's now such a big part of our lives came to be invented?
I know. Okay, this sounds strange, talking into a microphone. I know the word invented seems odd to talk about middle age, because of course people have always been middle age. But what was different that happened about 150 years ago in the 19th century was that people began to think of themselves as middle age. They identified themselves as middle age. You know, there was no such thing as clothes that were appropriate for middle age, or that it was a topic worthy of thinking about or writing about.
So you mean people acted the same and dressed the same if they were 18?
Yeah,
if they
pretty
were 60?
much. I mean, it was, you know, remember, it's an agrarian economy. I mean, basically you were young. Youth was considered from pretty much till 7 years old. No, a childhood went to 7 years old. Youth went from about 7 to 30, and then 30 to about 70 was an adult, and then there was old age. And those were the four ages, and you can actually see those in a lot of illustrations from the 19th century. It shows the four ages of man. In fact, there's this very famous, I talk about it in the book, series of Thomas Cole paintings, and it's the four ages, which is childhood, youth, adulthood, or manhood, and old age. So it's only really when the country begins to change, industrialization starts to happen, and also I think one of the most important things was the fact that women had fewer children. You know, most people think when they say, oh, well, there was no middle age because people died earlier. But that really wasn't the case. You know, people knew that middle age, they didn't mistake 40 or 50, even though not that many people lived that long. But in 1800, the typical woman had, let's say, 8 kids. So by the time the last kid was up and out of the house, she was dead, basically. By 1900, it was much more common for women to have, let's say, 3 children. And so by 40, 45, she was done with child rearing. And suddenly there was this new episode in the lifespan that was middle age.
Do we have an accepted definition of what middle age is?
That is the first question that everybody always wants to know.
I made it the second, so just
the second.
Different.
That's right. Well, I call the book, I call middle age in the book a never land, that younger people never want to enter it, and when they're older, they never want to leave it. The number is really the least, in my mind, the least significant. 40 has traditionally been a number that people have chosen to depict the entrance of middle age, but it really has no biological or chronological significance. It's just more that the number 40 has had a certain resonance in Western culture, and that's why. But much more, I think, is sociologically or psychologically. Are your children grown, independent, or your parents failing or dead? You know, those are the things. Where are you in your career? That's what makes you feel middle age.
A lot of the discussion, as you said, was about what's appropriate. This is, you know, you talk in the book about how there came to be this whole series of magazines, especially for women, articles telling them what they should wear, what they should be doing. Do you think that that has changed in recent years? I mean, it feels to me that there's less of that what's appropriate talk?
Well, on the one hand, it is true that styles and conventions are much looser now, and there is much more freedom. But on the other hand, I actually think it's even worse in a way because of our 24/7 culture, the rise of reality TV, I think, of which half of the shows are, you dress horribly, let me fix you up, or your hair is terrible. And so, if anything, I think it's just the commercial culture that we're in is constantly telling us this is the way we're supposed to look. And actually, one of the things that I object to about middle age is that it's come to be the definition of a successful middle age is looking young. It's not as if suddenly our taste about middle age that we think, being a few pounds more or wrinkles are more attractive, but rather we define success in middle age as pretending you're not middle age.
You talk in the book about how in the 1800s until about 1860 or 1880, the trend was to kind of suggest that you were a little older than you were. The fashions were tailored to make people look more mature. The powdered wig made people look older, and then something changed. And suddenly we were trying for the opposite.
Right. I mean, I don't know that people recognize that the reason men wore powdered wigs was to look older, and even the style of dress was such to emphasize their age because experience and maturity were really respected. And particularly if you think of it in a society where a lot of the population isn't literate, there isn't the kind of vast communication system that we have now, there wasn't universal education, experience is really much more valued. So, but it's only really I think the real turning point is the 1920s, when things really change and the youth culture really takes off. And I think that has to do both with industrialization and with, mass culture, mass advertising, which is when that really starts.
Right. Let's talk about some of the myths of middle age. I was shocked in the book to read that the midlife crisis is not a scientific fact.
I know.
Is that really true?
And this is a thing that I find amazing because actually the research now about the midlife crisis is at least 12 years old. I mean, it's been out and I, of course, for publicity purposes, we like to put it like groundbreaking, bursting the myth of the midlife crisis, when in fact that myth has been burst many times. But
we still believe it. We still talk about it.
We still believe it. And one of the things that I find interesting is that even though it's kind of being debunked, the narrative is so strong. One of the research studies found that when they went back to people who said they had a midlife crisis and they asked them, to say the specifics of it, it turned out that most of the people, actually, the event that they were talking about did not happen in middle age. It actually happened when they were in the late 20s or their early 30s, or maybe it happened in their late 60s. But they kind of fit it into this narrative of the midlife crisis because that's the story that we tell about our lives.
That was one of the things I found most interesting in the book. You have this kind of concept of, life stages as a narrative, that we tell ourselves all kinds of stories about where we are in our lives.
Exactly. I mean, actually, I really think the best definition for middle age, in a way, is it's a story that we tell about our lives. And that story at one point had it that midlife was the height of one's wealth, power, and influence. And then it became that midlife was the beginning of decline. And that is still a very powerful story, although I think the baby boomers have put a lot of effort into kind of changing that narrative, but it's a hard one to change.
The baby boomers, we have to talk about them, right? I know that they like for us to talk about them all the time anyway, but there are so many of them, and they're in midlife now.
Well, actually, I think it was last year was the first year that they started to turn 65. So depending on whether you ask them whether they're middle-aged or not. In fact, the Pew Foundation did a survey in 2009 asking people between 50 and 64 when middle age ended, and the average was 71. So I think by the time the boomers are done, middle age is going to go into 95. So, but one reason I think that we talk and we're so, middle age, it just comes up everywhere in the culture, is because the baby boomer generation is 78 million people. They have exerted this gravitational pull on the culture from the time they were little. And at every point in their lives, they've kind of, been the center of attention. And now that's exactly the same thing that's happened when they hit middle age. And pretty soon it's going to be, the focus will be on elderly people, and the next generation of middle age people, which will be Generation X or the millenniums, that's going to be a very different middle age for them because of demographics.
Another of these myths, I hope it's a myth, is maybe it's not quite a myth, but the idea that our brains start to deteriorate, as soon as we're old enough to drink. As soon as we hit 21, the brain starts to go. Is that true?
Right. Well, no, it's not true. You have at least until 25, I think. There's been enormous change in our thinking about the brain and intelligence. Number one is that most researchers don't think about intelligence as a single lump that you can kind of weigh on a scale. It's really dozens, if not hundreds, of skills that make up intelligence. And some of those skills do fall off as you age. Probably your 20s is the time at the height, particularly, let's say, for memory. That's one, or speed of calculation. That's another one. And that set of skills tend to be referred to as what's known as fluid intelligence skills. And a lot of those are inborn. And they're often things that we think of maybe being tested on an SAT test, abstract reasoning. But there's a different set of skills that are referred to as crystallized intelligence skills. And those improve with age. And those are based on learning, education, social skills. So for instance, social reasoning, making managerial decisions, dealing with people, making policy decisions, financial decision-making. A bunch of economists looked at this, and between 43 and 63 are the best ages for that. Not only because of experience and knowledge, but also because of the way you assess risk. That's a very important component of financial management, and people who are in middle age are much better at assessing risk than people who are younger.
What are some of the things, you talk a lot in the book about this, is it Midas? This big project of studying middle age in many ways. What are the things that they've learned about steps that we can take to have happy, productive, just positive middle years?
Right. Well, there's a couple of things. First, let me just explain what Midas is. It's this massive study that was initially started by a foundation and which the federal government took over funding about 10 years ago. It started in 1989. The third round is actually just beginning now. The federal government just financed another $21 million, and it's a long-term study, and it's probably one of the largest, most comprehensive nationwide studies that's being done now. And so at the centerpiece of it is this survey that they've been following thousands of people over the years and will continue to. And researchers can use this data set, and so there's been hundreds of studies based on this. And it's like a lot of things. There's a web of things, and that tend to go together, just like college education tends to go with better health and better financial situation. It's the same thing with middle age. So certainly there's physical exercise, which we all know. Not only is that the thing to keep you physically healthy, it's also the best thing for your brain. So if the fear of getting fat doesn't get you to the gym, maybe the fear of getting dementia will. So that's one thing. The second thing is brain learning. So particularly if people haven't gone to college, they can still compensate in a way. Because education seems to almost be this weatherproofing against brain deterioration to make your brain age seem 10 years younger on skills that they otherwise would not have. And the other thing that's really important is a feeling that you can make a difference. It's like Tinkerbell, do you believe in fairies? If you believe you have control over your life, you tend to do more things to better your both physical and mental health, and therefore your physical and mental health is better. And so it's this kind of self-reinforcing loop.
You talk in the book about now, the last section is something, the midlife industrial complex, all of the things that are the kind of the goods that we can buy, the steps that we can take to maintain our youthful appearance. But it sounds like some of those actually, apart from being good for the economy perhaps, can be good for us because of that.
Right. I mean, I do think, if you look back and going back to the 20s, certainly there was a whole range of, they called them rejuvenation therapies, which included things like, for women, X-raying your ovaries, and for men, implanting monkey testicles.
We'll be doing that in the back of the room.
That's right. So we have wine, cheese, and monkey testicles. But, and today, I think, there are also a lot of quacks and kind of treatments out there, but there also are more things that we actually, science has come up with that can make you look and feel better. And so, and part of that has to do with the whole self-help movement, which is one of those things where it's kind of a vice and a virtue. I mean, on the one hand, it's done wonderful things. People have, embraced self-help to give up drugs and drinking, or to really improve themselves, or, their physical and mental health. But it also can become this kind of, taskmaster, almost tyrannical, that it's constantly this feeling that you're not doing enough to help yourself, and that you must constantly be in this road, this like treadmill of self-improvement, endlessly self-improving.
Or another thing that we should feel guilty about.
Exactly. That all the things that you're not doing. And I think that's part of it, is trying to balance those two things. But the midlife industrial complex, I called it a complex in two senses. One, a complex because it's this kind of sprawling economic enterprise, but a complex in the psychological sense, like an inferiority complex, because that's part of what the advertising does, is create all these insecurities or so-called maladies, and then here's the cure for them.
Do you think middle-aged people get enough respect in this society? I mean, it seems like it's going to help that the boomers have been in this stage. But, it seems, for example, on television, only 18s to 34, 18 to 45 seem to count for anything.
Right.
Shouldn't people in middle age get more respect, count more?
Well, I think that's one of the interesting things about the boomer generation, which on the one hand has been demanding, saying, well, middle age is, not this washed up territory. Yet, on the other hand, nobody kind of wants to embrace middle age. So, no, I really don't think it is. And, one of the constants, unfortunately, since the late 19th century has been age discrimination. And even though during today's recession, younger people are more likely, there's a higher unemployment rate, so they're more likely to lose their job, but middle-aged people, once they do lose it, have a much more time of getting rehired. So they're unemployed for a longer period of time, even though the numbers are not quite as great.
And they lose more even when they do get a job. They're
right. Oftentimes, it's rare to have it at the same level of pay or benefits.
Are there questions in the room from people here?
I was wondering if your scope was the United States, or if you had a chance to look at surveys or Megas-type surveys in other countries.
I focus mainly on the United States, which was both just in terms of narrowing the subject matter on a research level. One of the interesting things about Midas, though, is that there is an international component, and they are doing some comparative surveys with other countries, and that stuff is very interesting. And that's really, I think, where you see this idea of middle age being a story or a cultural fiction, because you see how it's treated differently. Certainly, traditionally, Asian societies, there was much more respect for the elderly. Given the global culture, even those societies that did respect age more are kind of now rolling back on that because of the the global culture. But definitely you can see different ways that it's treated in different countries.
In terms of public policy, how exactly could the United States be more accommodating towards those entering the middle age?
Well, it's funny. I don't know if any of you are aware, there's this book that Chris Buckley wrote a few years ago called Boomsday. And the idea, he kind of does this, that there's all of these lobbyists who are pushing for like an acid reflux, tax break and big screen TVs so that, as your site goes, you should get a subsidy for those. I mean, there's two things, though, that I think some of the research points to that's interesting. One is about education, and that's not only about middle-aged people. If it turns out to be true that education is like this kind of mental weatherproofing, it seems to me that the calculation about whether young people decide to go to college really changes, because now, since the recession has gone on, there's been a lot of conversation about, well, does it make sense to get a job as opposed to putting the investment into college? And certainly in the long run, wages show no question that it pays off to invest in college. But here is a kind of another dimension of that, which is mental health in the long run, or I shouldn't say mental health, cognitive ability. Having advanced education is really a protector against that. And, we do have laws, age discrimination laws. They're very difficult to enforce. There's even some question as to how effective they are, whether in some states, there's been some research done that says businesses are less willing to hire older people if there is age discrimination laws, and it's almost impossible to prove you weren't hired because of age, let alone, being discriminated against once you're there.
I haven't read your book, obviously, but I've read more of your articles. And you said that those things of midlife crisis. But did you work on Levinson's work, who was one of the people who invented them? Of course, it keeps moving.
Right. Well, you obviously know the history of this very well. The term midlife crisis was actually coined in 1965 by a Canadian psychologist. And he was really talking about the midlife crisis in regard to great artists, and his idea was that the really profound artistic genius really happened in the second half of life, and that you went through this midlife crisis, but when you came out of it, you had a much more profounder and deeper understanding of experience. But then another psychologist, Daniel Levinson, did a lot of work, and Gail Sheehy's book is really based on a lot of his research at the time, and he looked at 40 men in four huge group and I mean, this is the thing with a lot of research, it's based on very small samples, and that gets kind of globalized. And so one of the questions in looking back at these 40 men who seem to go through this midlife crisis. I mean, if you think about these men, they were coming of age during the 60s, because that's when he's doing his research, in the early 70s, watching them. And so there's this youth revolution, there's a whole, that's the era of the man in the gray flannel suit. I mean, that may have been very specific to a generational cohort of that particular group of men and not applicable of middle age in general. But in the larger studies, they found that, really only about 10% of people report a midlife crisis. I mean, it's just like things happen, deaths, losing a job, crises happen all throughout life. If they happen in middle age, people say, the midlife crisis. But it's not really having any special significance to that.
Actually, Levinson has the pre-transitional 30 crisis. And then he
Right.
has women who are actually different 10 years.
Right, yes. I mean, he actually did recognize, and in fact, he did say that, and which is true, that your late 20s or your early 30s are much more likely to be a time of crisis, which if you think about it, makes sense. That's when you're deciding your career, deciding whether to get married, to have kids. That is really fits the midlife crisis definition much more than when you're middle age. Well, part of it has to do, one of the things I was saying in the beginning, that the chronological age I find the least useful in terms of deciding if you're middle age. And I mean, I guess there partially is some personal experience. I had my first child at 40. So, when you're changing diapers and looking at preschools, you don't really feel very middle age. And that's something that people a lot younger are doing. So for me, it was such a difference, even just looking back at my mother's generation, who by the time she was 40 was, getting ready to get her kids off to college. And that's why I think definitions are, the number doesn't really mean that much. And I was just curious to go back, there had been other work done, historical work on the invention of childhood or the invention of the teenager, and there's been a lot of books written about that. And nobody, though, had done that same kind of historical study on middle age, so that's why I decided to do that. So I was just hoping to finish the book by the time I was still middle age.
Let's take one more question.
Okay.
You mentioned that successful middle age now is defined by how young one managed to look. Did you touch upon sort of anxieties or the studies about anxieties that are created by this sort of definition, middle age, where you see some loss of emotion aging with grace?
Absolutely. And in fact, that's part of why I use that term, the midlife industrial complex, because it is very psychological. And I think, not to go off too much on a tangent, but I think we've lost that sense of it almost in a spiritual sense as well. I mean, in the 19th century, growing older was viewed much more as a journey, and a journey at the end of which you went to heaven, and there was salvation, redemption. And now in our society, and with that view, there was the idea that every age along that journey had a kind of purpose and use and experience. But in a much more secularized society and a very commercial society, again, it's like youth is the only age that's really seen as being creative and productive. And, once you kind of hit middle age, then it's just the slow decline. And one of the comparisons I make is, why is it that we celebrate passing for younger as something to be congratulated on, yet think about it in the context of race or being gay, that we see that as a kind of being forced to deny one's own authenticity, yet passing for youth is seen as something to be congratulated on. And I think that's odd, and I think that's reflective of how we look at it in society. Oh, let's just take that one more.
Through your lecture, I had always in mind a concept that was by the 19th century very, very used of the 30-year-old woman. It was actually a novel by read about that.
Mhm.
And the 30-year-old woman would be that woman that is mature, that already had his children, which was in a period in her life when she could consider everything more passed away. And this is not a 30-year woman now. And that could resemble, in my opinion, the whole concept behind the middle-aged woman. And my question is, if the 30-year-old woman is not the mature woman now, the 40-year-old woman certainly won't be the mature woman anymore, and the 50-year-old. So aren't we enhancing youth every day, hopefully?
Yes, I agree that we are. Although for women, you could also look at it that, I mean, one of the interesting things is that the researchers found that women actually think middle age starts and ends later than men. Although culturally, we saw for women, middle age was kind of defined previously as beginning at 35 or even 30, because, kind of after childbirth, that was, a woman was defined by her sexuality. But interestingly enough, in America, in magazines at that same time, we're talking about, in the same way that you are talking about the 30-year-old woman, the 50-year-old woman. And so I think that the progressive era, when feminism was very strong in the United States between 1890 and 1920, was really what they call the renaissance of the middle age. And they were talking about women then. Men were having a really tough time in the factory because they weren't as fast as younger men. And so middle age was a really bad period for them. But for women, middle-class women, it was really this flowering. So it was different. Although one other thing I think is interesting is when they asked, Midas, this study, asked people over 65 what age they would most like to go back to, they bypassed their teens, their 20s, and their 30s, and they picked their 40s. And I thought that was really said something about being middle-aged. So anyway.
Thank you. So, Patricia will be signing over there, and there's cheese and wine over here, and enjoy.
Thank you.
It was great.